on the National Geographic channel, there's a show entitled Making the Familiar Unfamiliar. And it's a show that goes out of its way to look at things that we all think we know and see them from different perspectives, from different angles, and to appreciate the complexity and the beauty that we often overlook. One of the suggestions that they've made for this, to practice this at home, is your child or your grandchild, if you have a little one, a preschooler, take your smartphone and set it on the camera and give it to them. And let them walk around and take pictures of whatever it is that fascinates them. And then at some point, when you have your phone back, just browse through the hundreds of pictures that they will have taken. Sometimes it's a little hard to figure out what it is they actually took a picture of. But if you think about it long enough, if you trace the steps of where they went, you can figure it out. And it's really fascinating because things that you and I see every single day and we don't give them a second thought, all of a sudden we contemplate them from a completely different angle, a different perspective, and we see things that we've overlooked. The Bible is exactly like that. There are things in the Bible that are so familiar, particularly if you've been in church a long time. There are stories that you know backwards and forwards. And yet, familiarity breeds boredom. It's those sermon topics that you go, oh, I know this one. And you sort of mentally check out because you've heard this one before. But what if I ask you today, as we look at a very familiar story, what if I ask you to try and imagine yourself looking at all of it from a completely different angle, giving yourself the opportunity to see things that you've never seen before? You see, where we are in the Gospel of Mark, we took a break last week and sort of saw a sidebar story with the execution of John the Baptist, that holy man. But before that, we had the story of Jesus after he was rejected in his hometown of Nazareth. He marshals his disciples and he sends them out in pairs to go do ministry. Now, it's the first time that they've ever done ministry without Jesus physically being present. He sends them out and they have his authority that he's delegated to them. They have his word, the word of God that they can use. But it's a real stretch for them because Jesus is not there. They come back from this mission. They've gone from village to village and they've been traipsing around the countryside for a number of days, a number of weeks probably. And they come back and they are bursting with stories. They have a testimony time where Jesus is there, I think, reveling in their joy as they describe the way God used them. They had seen God do stuff through Jesus. They knew the power that belonged to Jesus as the Son of God, but they never dreamed that they would be usable in those same ways. They had been there when people were healed. They had been involved in miracles that they'd seen from Jesus, but now the Spirit was using them, and they are just bursting with energy until they're not. The enthusiasm and the energy high that came with reliving their mission almost immediately becomes exhaustion. They've gone from place to place. Not to mention, it wasn't just their mission, but the whole year before with Jesus, they've barely set foot anywhere that they weren't surrounded by crowds pressing in to be with Jesus. They were exhausted. And what we're going to find in this part of Mark chapter 6 is Jesus, aware of his disciples and concerned for them, makes a recommendation that they should go to a desolate place. Now that sounds pretty horrible. The word desolate, sounds like wilderness or desert. But you got to understand, desolate means solitary and alone, which frankly, after the last year that the disciples have been through, that sounded like a pretty good deal. As they get on a boat to go to this desolate place, you can almost use your sanctified imagination to see that most of these guys were sailors by trade. They were fishermen. They loved being on the lake. That was not only where they worked, but that was sort of where they found themselves. And so I think after traipsing along the dusty roads between villages for a matter of weeks, just to set foot on a boat and to push out onto the lake, I think you can just imagine kind of the exhaustion beginning to drain, the stress beginning to drain as they all just lay back and they're just like, oh, finally a retreat is coming. Well, what we're going to find out is apparently they didn't have any favorable winds because it took them a long time to get from one side of the lake to the desolate area where Jesus was taking them. In fact, it took them long enough that the crowds, seeing them get into the boat and estimating where they were going to be, they rushed around the edges of the lake only to be standing there waiting for the boat when it arrived. Now, you don't have to have too much imagination to see how this plays out, because the disciples, probably laid back in the boat, probably resting, as they begin to approach land, they start stirring and they sit up and they look out. People. We call it in pastor circles, we call it ministry fatigue. It comes because you give out and you give out and you give out and you meet these needs and you answer these questions and you teach here and you preach there and you do this thing and you go over here and you have this meeting and you hold this appointment and you do all of these things until you wake up one morning and you go, I can't see another human being. That's where they were. Ministry fatigue. This was supposed to be our retreat, our weekend away. We're going to camp for a few days. Nobody's around. We're just going to fish and eat and we're just going to rest. Except we're going to find out that there's a crowd, not just any crowd. The Bible tells us that there were 5,000 men. And that's exactly what it means. There is a Greek word that means people. That's not the word that Mark uses here. He uses the word that specifically means men. So if he tells us there were 5,000 men, we can assume that total with women and children, it was probably a crowd of 10 to 12,000 people waiting as the boat pulls to shore with the disciples all going, I can't believe this. All right, that sets the stage. Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 31. They've been telling Jesus about their mission trip, and it says that he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. That was their daily schedule. They didn't even have time to eat. Jesus, not only concerned about teaching them what they would need to know to carry on his mission, but he's concerned for them as human beings. He says, you guys need rest. Come away with me, and we'll go to a place where it's lonely, where it's desolate, and you can be restored. Verse 32, and they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. And the people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. And when Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and began saying, this place is desolate, it's already quite late, send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered and said to them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat? And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go look. And when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish, and he commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. And they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves. And he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them, and he divided up the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces and also of the fish. And there were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. Now, I want to talk about this particular miracle story because it's clearly important. And it is clearly important because of every miracle that is recorded in the four Gospels. This is the only miracle that is recorded in all four of the Gospels. That tells us right up front that there's something here of particular significance that we need to pay attention to. Now, it's easy to just survey this and go, well, the lesson is that Jesus can provide for his people. Okay, yeah, that's true. That's not the lesson, okay? Let's look at this from a new angle and not assume that we know this story and we can dismiss it because we're familiar with it. Let me take you through and show you some things. First of all, I want you to see the story set up. There is an unexpected circumstance here. The short lake trip was probably sort of restorative already for these guys who loved being out on the lake, especially after the dusty paths that they had taken on their mission as they traveled among the villages. But because they apparently had no favorable wind, they make their way only to discover that a crowd has beat them there and they're waiting. And it is a massive crowd. Now, one scholar that, I love the way scholars are so dismissive of the Word of God as though they're smarter than the people who wrote it. One commentary I read this week said the number is vastly overblown. It's not possible that there were actually 5,000 or certainly not 10 or 12,000 people there, because if you went to this desolate place, by definition, it's less populated. If you took all of the cities probably within walking distance of that place, you're talking about somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people total living in that area. So how do you have a crowd of 10 or 12,000 people? I'll tell you exactly how you do it. In the First Great Awakening, when the colonies were coming together under a movement of the Spirit of God, there was a preacher who traveled up and down the eastern seaboard by the name of George Whitefield. Whitefield was the most popular preacher of the Awakening era, and his itinerary often preceded him as news would travel of where he was going to be. There are lots of fascinating stories about farmers dropping their tools, their implements of the trade in the middle of the field and leaving them there as they raced to their barns to get on their horses when somebody rode past and said, George Whitefield is going to the village. What would happen is Whitefield would travel to a village that might have a few hundred residents, only to discover that waiting for him would be crowds somewhere near 20,000 people. Because once the news of his itinerary got out, people dropped everything and they came from all over. Wagons and horses racing at full speed, lathering from the heat of the exertion to get there and not miss the great Whitefield preaching. Let me tell you something. If Whitefield can draw crowds to small villages from all around that numbers in the tens of thousands, I promise you Jesus could. People had come from everywhere. And when they saw these guys get on the boat, did you notice that verse that said they saw them getting on the boat and they recognized them? It's a statement of one of the results of the ministry, of the mission trip, as the disciples went by twos into all of the villages and delivering the message of the kingdom, telling about Jesus, performing miracles. People saw them and they recognized them. They knew who they were. And getting into the boat, they said, we want more of that. We want more of what they taught us. We want more of what they showed us. And so they would gather together and they began to march at speed around the lake. Don't ever write off numbers that the Bible gives you. Oh, that it wasn't possible. I promise you it's possible. If you knew that Jesus Christ was going to be in Bristow, you'd figure out how to get to Bristow. That's what was happening here. Now, they look up and this crowd, this monstrous crowd is there. And you can almost hear the groan of despair as the disciples go, oh, we cannot catch a break. Compare that to Jesus, who steps off the boat and he looks out and it says that he had compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Let me tell you about that phrase. Sheep without a shepherd. If you don't know what it means, it might suggest that they were just scattered. They just needed somebody to organize them and bring them back together. But let me tell you where that phrase comes from. In the last days of Moses, before he died, he prays a prayer to God, asking that God would raise up the correct man to be successor to Moses as the ruler and the leader over the nation of Israel. And in that prayer, he says, Lord, don't leave your people like sheep without a shepherd. What Moses is suggesting is not we just need somebody who can organize the people. He's saying they need somebody who can provide the spiritual nourishment. We need somebody, a shepherd, who can nurture and protect and give them spiritual leadership that they need. That's what's in the phrase. And so Mark is explicit by using the phrase that comes from Moses when Jesus looked at the people and he had compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He's not suggesting they're unorganized and they need somebody to get them all moving in the same direction. He's suggesting that they are sheep that have not been well cared for and they are starving. And so he starts to teach. Now here's the thing. It appears in this story that they arrived there in the morning and the crowd was there waiting for them, and Jesus taught until late into the evening. The experts in our generation, I regularly see this in the circles that I travel in, the experts tell us that the American evangelical Christian today has an attention span that allows them to listen to a sermon for somewhere between 18 to 22 minutes. I'm sorry. Here's the thing. We have a short attention span because we have successfully suppressed the fact that we are spiritually starving in this country. We're distracted by every little thing and it pulls us away. I've been in a number of places across Asia. I've taught several times in India and in other places. And it's always amazing to me because you go and you say, okay, here's the schedule for this meeting and we're going to sing and we're going to do this and we're going to have some special music and we're going to have a prayer time. And then here's the teaching time. That's the teaching time? Yeah, 3 hours. Okay. I'm in. I have taught on more than one occasion for 3 hours straight with nobody getting up, nobody moving, nobody looking at their watch. Why? Because there are people who are spiritually starving and they know they're starving and they're not getting up from the table until all the food is gone. That's what was happening on this day. They didn't bring lunches because they didn't know the day was going to go like that. They didn't bring supplies. It wasn't an outing. They just wanted to see Jesus. They didn't think beyond just getting to where he was. And as he taught, they sat there for the day. Even if their stomachs began to growl, they ignored that because they were soaking up the spiritual nourishment that he was giving. And it's only at the end of the day, as Jesus begins to wrap up, that the question of physical food comes into play. Now, that's the setup of the story. Jesus sees the crowd differently than the disciples see the crowd. For them, he wants to be the great shepherd that provides the desperate need of spiritual nourishment that they're looking for. Now, that's the setup of the story that Mark gives us. But I want you to see the perspective of the disciples. They're looking at this. Now, they've kind of had a bad attitude all through the day. You say, well, how can you tell that? Well, the language that Mark uses in the Greek actually communicates to us a bit of impatience, even some low-key disrespect to Jesus. So let me see if I can read this the way that I think the Greek language communicates it. One thing, they're going to approach Jesus with some objections to their situation. And frankly, their objections were eminently reasonable. They're going to say it's late, and it was late. They're going to say we're in a desolate place. We're far away from anything that's convenient. That's true. They're going to say that if we had bread, we'd have to send a long way off to have it catered in because there's no quick trip close by. And even if we could have it catered in, to feed this many people would require about a year's salary for a working man, 200 denarii. Everything that they calculated was actually accurate, except for one thing. They left out the incalculable factor, which is they forgot Jesus Christ. Now, I want you to catch their irritation here, barely suppressed. It says in verse 35, and when it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and began saying, this place is desolate and it's already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. In other words, send them away because we're waiting for our retreat to kick in. But Jesus doesn't back down. He says this, you give them something to eat. Wait, what? You give them something to eat. And they said to him, again, sense the irritation, shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat? And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Now, think about this. I know it's always dangerous to put too much energy into trying to get tone out of the written text. But use your sanctified imagination with me for a minute. Jesus could have been himself irritated at their irritation toward him. I mean, he could have said, go see if there are any loaves around. I don't think that's how that happened. I don't think that's what took place. I see it in a different way. They're complaining. We can't do this. The situation's impossible. We couldn't get bread even if it was available. We couldn't afford it even if it was here. The crowd's too big. Just send them home. Just let them fend for themselves. And I think the tone of Jesus' voice was, how many loaves do we have? Go look. In other words, don't write off the impossibility of this situation until we see what resources are available. Fine. And so they begin to survey. They go through the crowd. Anybody have any food? Anybody bring anything? Do you got anything? Anybody? We know from one of the other gospel writers that Andrew finds this little boy. He does happen to have a sack lunch. I don't know what his day was supposed to be, but mom packed him a lunch, 5 little loaves of bread, kind of like what you get at an Italian restaurant. You know, those little short loaves, 5 little loaves of bread, a little flatter, a little less yeast, and 2 small fish, probably smoked and salted so that they stayed good. And he has his little sack lunch there, and Andrew brings the boy and comes to Jesus. Turns out 5,000 men, additional women and children, and this is what we have. Here's what I want you to see, and this is something that you may have not ever seen about this miracle. This miracle is different from every other miracle in the Gospels. Because in every other miracle, Jesus is responding to a need that is presented to him. Somebody comes and they are lame, or they're blind, or they have a family member that's died, or they have an illness that no one's been successful with. They come to him out of desperation and they present their needs. This miracle is different from every other miracle because this is the only miracle in the Gospels where Jesus initiated the crisis. He could have let him go 3 hours earlier. He could have instructed them to make their way. At the very least, he could have taken up an offering and given the money to the disciples and sent them away 3 hours earlier so they could go and try and buy supplies and come back. Jesus taught the whole day. He knew precisely what he was doing, and he ends the day with 10 to 12,000 hungry people, and he turns to his disciples and he hands them an unsolvable problem in their minds. Feed these people. We can't feed these people. Well, at least look and see what you have available. Just check out what your resources are. What's happening here is Jesus is taking his 12 disciples. They're just coming off the spiritual high of this mission trip, and they've seen incredible things happen. But as soon as they're back in the presence of Jesus, they sort of check out. They're not living by the same desperate grasp of the power of Christ through faith that they had to live by when he sent them out and they were not physically with Jesus. The crowd is still there and Jesus is still teaching, but the 12 have already checked out for vacation. And Jesus intentionally teaches late into the day to set up a crisis of how do we provide food for this size crowd, and then he hands the crisis into the hands of the disciples. And they freak. It's unsolvable. Can't be fixed. All right. What the disciples from their perspective thought was an unsolvable problem, Jesus proves that it is in fact an unmatched opportunity. They come back to Jesus and they said there's 5 loaves and 2 fish. So he commanded everybody to sit down and he organized them. This is how they knew the numbers, because they organized themselves into groups of 50s and 100s. And probably all across the plain where they had been gathered, they separate out into these groups waiting for food that they think might be coming. Now, the actual fact of the miracle, it says here in verse 41, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves, and he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them, and he divided up the 2 fish among them all. Now, the actual fact of the miracle is not given to us here. All we know is that Jesus did the dividing, but we don't know if he kept dividing until the multiplication was enough to feed 10,000 people, or if he divided it into serving baskets and handed one to each disciple, and as they went, no matter how much they handed out, the basket was continually replenished. There are miracles similar to that in other parts of the Bible. We aren't given the details of how the miracle occurred. We simply know that as the disciples began to go through the crowds to groups of 50 and 100, they gave them both bread and fish. Now, I read a real liberal commentary this week, and it always fascinates me what kind of intellectual hoops, what kind of mental gymnastics you have to jump through to be smarter than the Bible. Because in one of the commentaries that I read, the guy makes the argument. He goes, this was a sacramental meal. What he meant by that was Jesus just divided up the loaves and the fishes into tiny, tiny, tiny little portions. And he gave one portion each person because it was symbolic that he was the one who would feed them in eternity. Okay, tiny, tiny little pieces spread out. 5 loaves, 2 fishes divided by 10,000. That's not even as much as you're going to get this morning for the Lord's Supper. But here's the thing about that. In order to believe such an absurd interpretation, you have to completely ignore verse 42, which says, and they all ate and were satisfied. Folks, this was an actual miracle of multiplication. And Jesus provided out of not much, enough. They go through the crowd. The text tells us that not only was everybody satisfied, they ate to their fill, But then it says they went around and collected 12 baskets of leftovers. Now that's interesting. Actually, the baskets are going to play into the lesson that we're going to look at next week in the next section of the Gospel of Mark. But Jesus has them go through and collect. They weren't going to throw any of this away, because here's the thing. Part of this lesson is that Jesus is not going to show up every single day and dance to our tune and perform a miracle so that every day we have supernatural provision like that and we never have to do anything, we never have to work. That's not how this works. He has the disciples collect the leftovers into baskets, 12 baskets, each one carrying a basket of leftovers. That's probably their meals for the next couple of days. Jesus was providing that, and he was teaching them to make use of the abundance that he had given to use it faithfully as it goes along. Now, they couldn't throw away those pieces and expect Jesus to just pony up another miracle the next day. That's the way he was trying to teach them. Now, here's the thing. And this is the part I want you to get. In the miracles that we have throughout the rest of the Gospels, typically after Jesus does miracles, there is a summary verse that sort of wraps up a chapter or a section of a chapter. And those summary verses will say things like, "And many people believed and followed him," or "Some did not believe and they went away." There's some description of the response to the miracle. In 4 accounts of the feeding of the 5,000, we don't have any summary verses of the reaction from the crowd. Listen, if you feed 10,000 people supernaturally, that's going to cause a stir. What it tells me is that the crowd was not aware of where the food was coming from, how it was being received, the food that was being distributed to them. They didn't know a miracle was happening. Well, what is this for then? Because this whole miracle, the intentional setup by Jesus to create a crisis, the instruction to go find whatever resources you have available, it was all designed for the disciples. This miracle was only for them because they were still having to learn the lesson that even when we don't have much to offer, once it's given to Jesus and Jesus factors into the equation, what happens is enough is always going to be there. He's still teaching them that he is to be trusted in every situation, particularly the ones that appear to be humanly impossible. Can you imagine if you lived long enough to read Mark's gospel when it was published, probably in the late 50s, the decade of the first century in the late 50s, reading that going, I remember that day. I was there. Jesus taught. You mean that food was miraculously provided? The crowd didn't know. But the disciples knew. And they never forgot it. You want to know how I know they never forgot it? Because remember, the Gospel of Mark is the recollections of Peter. Peter is relaying these stories to Mark, and Mark is writing them down. Go back to one verse that I want you to see. In verse 41, Peter is telling this story to Mark, and Mark is recording it for us. And Peter is using the language that matches the language that Jesus used the night before the cross at that Passover meal that became what we call the Lord's Supper. Look at this. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking upward toward heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves, and he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them, and he divided up the 2 fish among them all. The language, the terminology is exactly the same as the Lord's Supper. He took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke the bread, and he gave it to each one. You see, years later, Peter is telling this story to Mark, and Mark is writing it down so that we'll have it. And Peter says, you know, it was after the ascension when Jesus went to heaven. It was after Pentecost when the church was birthed. It was probably that first time when we followed the instructions that he gave us the night before the cross. And he said, whenever you share this meal, I want you to think about me. And Peter said, you know, he took the bread. He gave thanks. He broke the bread. He distributed it. And in the Lord's Supper, Peter flashed back to a day on a desolate hillside where Jesus fed 5,000 people. When we take the Lord's Supper, it is an act of memory that is involved in this. And mostly, we let our memories drift back to the cross, and that is the primary connection for the Lord's Supper. But today, as we share the Lord's Supper, I want you to intentionally go back a year and a half before the cross to that desolate place where Jesus fed maybe 10, 12,000 people. And as we take the supper with the little bread that is symbolic and the little juice that is symbolic, you're not going to get full at this meal. But I want you to remember the lesson Jesus intended for his closest followers. And that is, there is no unsolvable problem once you offer what little you bring to the situation, and it is received and taken and used by Jesus Christ, who always makes it enough. In your life, think about the spiritual nurture that has been provided to you, and picture the great shepherd who regularly gives to you spiritual bread to make you strong, to build your faith, to make you adequate, to be used by his Spirit to change the world in the generation in which you live. As we come to the supper today, this is a reminder not only of the cross, but of the feeding of 5,000. A miracle, frankly, seen and recognized by a grand total of 12 people. The whole thing was because Jesus wanted them to know he's enough for what they need. It was preserved in all four Gospels specifically so that you and I would know that Jesus is all we need.